Yo, 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 what's good, YouTube? What's good? It's Stormy B-Man, and I am back welcoming you to Historical Boxing Conversations with Scrapbook Boxing for this Tuesday, September 21st, 2021, and this is episode number 2. The Scrapbook decided to come out and give you guys a historical retrospection on boxing with great conversations. And this evening, he's going to present a great story and backdrop for you for Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries. So with no further ado, allow me to introduce the star of the show, that's Scrapbook Boxing. What's going on with you, Scrap?
I'm good, Stormy. Takes one to know one, brother. I appreciate it this evening. Salute to the chat. I hope you have a good evening and enjoy this conversation. Now we're going to talk about July 4th, 1910. Fight took place in Reno, Nevada. It was between Jack Johnson and gentleman Jim Jeffries. He was known as the Boilermaker. And the reason why I wanted to have this conversation with you this evening is because most people about some of the hardships that fighters had to go through. They think that there were some hardships in the 60s, in the 70s, sometimes in the 80s. Definitely they believe there were some hardships now, but if you look back in history and you can see the times in which men had came, what they had to overcome, what they had to deal with, then you have a little better appreciation of what you have today. Now, Jack Johnson, his name was Little Arthur. That's what they called him. And he came from Galveston, Texas. He was a very strong young man, and he didn't know what he wanted to do with his life. And he would wind up traveling in a hobo cars, and he would try to find a good establishment for himself. Now, who was Jack Johnson? His name was John Arthur Johnson. He was born April 3rd, 1878 in Galveston, Texas. He died June 10th, 1946. He was 68 years of age at the time of his transition. And he would reside in Raleigh, North Carolina. Now, the story goes that Jack Johnson was very upset because he was a former champion. And he was used to getting some very good treatment as former champion. And he wound up getting into an altercation. He wanted to have something to eat at a restaurant. And he told him he had to go around back. This had never happened to Jack Johnson before. So he stood up to the person at the deli counter. And they wasn't tolerating that, so they threw him out. So he got into his car, and the legend goes that he speeded around the corner because he was upset, and the car flipped over and he went over a hill. Well, Jack Johnson was no longer loved or liked in this country. He was supposed to be going to see the Billy Conn and Joe Louis' second fight, 1946. So that's the story, how it goes with the death of Jack Johnson. Now, Jack Johnson was managed by Sam Fitzpatrick and George Little. He stood 6'1.5", had a 74-inch reach, had a record of 54 wins, 11 losses, 34 knockouts, 8 draws, and 6 knockouts. And they fought from November 1st, 1897 to 1931. He faced Klondike Keynes 3 times. Now, who was Klondike Keynes? He lost from 1898 to 1890 to Frank Childs. Frank Childs was a colored heavyweight champion. He lost twice to Sam Langford, who was also a colored heavyweight champion, but he was a colored heavyweight champion 5 separate times. He lost him in 1909 and lost to Denver Ed Martin June 25th, 1900. He had a draw with Jack Johnson, but he would defeat Mexican Pete Efforts. Cherinsky, Klondike Keynes, Frank Childs, Denver Ed Martin, Sam Bay, Sandy Ferguson, Joe Butler, Hank Griffin, Jack Jeffries, Marvin Hart, Joe Jeanette, young Peter Jackson, Joe Grimm, who was a very dirty fighter, Black Bills. Just an example of some of the fighters that Jack Johnson would be in the ring with. He would face Sam Langford, 15 rounds, 1906. Keep in mind, Sam Langford was a middleweight at that time. He weighed 168 pounds. In today's standards, that would be considered a super middleweight. And he was really the colored middleweight champion actually when he fought Jack Johnson. And it wound up going 15 rounds. Jack Johnson just fought Joe Jeanette a couple of weeks before that. He had a fractured hand. So he was owed the second opportunity by Jack Johnson should he become champion. It was actually written in a contract. And Jack Johnson had reneged that contract. He was in the ring with Peter Felix. Peter Felix was the cousin of the Black Prince, Peter Jackson. He was an Australian heavyweight champion and a colored heavyweight champion. I'm referring to the Black Prince, Peter Jackson. He was also in the ring with Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, May 19th, 1909. July 4th, 1910, Reno, Nevada, he was in the ring with Jim Jeffries, and that's the fight that we're going to be talking about this evening. Now, who was James Jeffries? His name was James Jackson Jeffries. He was known as the Boilermaker. He was born April 15th, 1875 in Carroll, Ohio. He died March 3rd, 1953. He was 77 years of age at the time of his death, and he would reside in Burbank, California. He stood 6 foot 1.5 inches, weighed 185 pounds, 215 pounds. He had a total bout career of 24 fights, 19 wins, 1 loss, 2 draws, 16 knockouts, and he was stopped 1 time by Jack Johnson. Now, June 9th, 1899 to August 26, 1904, James Jeffries was champion. He had 2 draws in his career. Once was the Gus ruling, July 16th, 1897, in McAdams Pavilion, San Francisco. He walked into the ring with a record of 6 wins and 2 losses. I'm speaking of Gus ruling. The second fighter was Joe Chowinski. He fought on November 30th, 1897 at the National Athletic Club in San Francisco, California. Now, Joe Chowinski had a record of 37 wins, 6 losses, and 3 draws coming into that fight with Jim Jeffries. Jim Jeffries had 19 wins, 8 technical knockouts, and 7 KOs. He defeated Bob Armstrong. Bob Armstrong was 24 years of age at that time, and Jim Jeffries was 23 years old. He defeated Peter Jackson. Peter Jackson was 36 years old, and Jim Jeffries was 22 years old. Keep in mind, these fellas were past their prime when they finally got a shot at Jim Jeffries, because the white fighters didn't want to fight the black fighters at certain times in their careers, and if they became champion, they froze them out completely. So we have to keep this in context when we look at the records of some of the fighters in the past. And James Jeffries was in the ring with Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. Knocked him out in 11 rounds. Walked into the ring with a record of 10 wins, no losses, 2 draws, and 8 KOs did James Jeffries. He had I think he was 24 years old, and he weighed 206 pounds, and Bob Fitzsimmons was 167 pounds, and he was 36 years old. All this is at the top of my head, so please forgive me. And what I want to tell you is that James J. Jeffries, although he was a very strong fighter, he didn't have that many championship fights. He was just a very strong individual. And like I said, he froze out a lot of the black fighters. He didn't give them the opportunities that they should have gotten. He gave them opportunities, but not as champion. He fought them when they were past their prime. That's just what it was. So James Jeffries was a very good fighter, but he didn't have enough fights for me to rate him in the top 10 of any ranking system, not even in the top 20, not even in the top 25. He was in the ring with fighters such as Hank Griffin, and Joe Chowinski, Peter Jackson, Tom Sarton, Bob Armstrong, Bob Fitzsimmons, James Corbett. And that was pretty much the big names that James Jeffries was in the ring with. Now, Jack Johnson. He fought James Jeffries. Jack Johnson was 32 years old, and James Jeffries was 35 years old. Johnson weighed 208 pounds, and James Jeffries was 227 pounds. They fought July 4th, 1910 in Reno, Nevada. Tex Rickard was the referee. The announcer was Billy Jordan, and Tex Rickard was also the promoter. He named it Fight of the Century. Jack Johnson's 5th title defense. Now, there was a timekeeper by the name of George Harding, and he was the timekeeper for many of the bouts in Australia. And he would timekeep a lot of the fights for the Black Prince, Peter Jackson. Like I told you, Peter Jackson was the Australian heavyweight champion, and then he wound up becoming the colored heavyweight champion. He defeated George Godfrey for that title, beat him in 33 rounds. Now, George Harding was a timekeeper in bouts with Peter Jackson versus Jim Corbett. The fight went 61 rounds. It was a draw. They fought May 21st, 1891. He was also a timekeeper for James J. Corbett and Bob Fitzsimmons. That fight took place March 17th, 1897. It was in Carson City, Nevada. And it was known as the solar plexus punch when Bob Fitzsimmons would knock him out in 14 rounds. He would become the heavyweight champion of the world. July 4th, 1910, Reno, Nevada. He would also be a timekeeper for that fight. So George Harding was a very well-reputed timekeeper during that time. Jack Johnson would become the colored heavyweight champion when he defeated Denver Ed Martin, February 5th, 1903. They fought at the Pavilion in Los Angeles, California. Shut off. Can you still hear me, Stormy?
Yes, sir. I can hear you.
Okay. All right. So some of the men that was announced in the ring that night with the James J. Jeffries and Jack Johnson fight. Well, you had fighters such as Tom Sharp. He was known as the Sailor Man. You had Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. You had Stanley Ketchel and Jake Kilrain, Abe Patel and Sam Langford, Bob Fitzsimmons and Tommy Burns, John O'Sullivan and Sam McVeigh. Now, Sam McVeigh would be in the corner of Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson only had 2 men in his corner, and you had about 6 men in the corner of gentleman Jim Jeffries. Now, Jim Jeffries, like I said, was 227 pounds. He stood 6 foot 1.5 inches. He had a 76.5-inch reach. He had a record coming into the bout of 19 wins, no losses, and 16 knockouts. Jack Johnson stood 6 foot and a half inches. He was 32 years old. He had a 74-inch reach, had a record coming into the bout of 49 wins, 5 losses, 10 draws, and 23 knockouts. Now, the Boilermaker Jim Jeffries was a 10-7 favorite coming into that bout. He had odds growing of 2.5 to 1. The original location for that bout was set for San Francisco, California. And Governor James Gillette decided to ban the contest because he was getting a lot of pressure. They didn't want to have this fight in their particular city because they felt it was going to be a riot, and they didn't want to be the city that a black fighter would defeat a white fighter. So he had too much pressure on, and he decided to ban the fight. So Tex Rickard, who was the promoter for that contest, he found another location. It was in Reno, Nevada. And it was going to work out good for Tex Rickard because they had the railroad that would meet the East and the West. That was the first time you would have a location for boxing like that. And he made these green woods out of a stadium, and that was the first time he did that. It was the biggest gate in boxing history, and Tex Rickard did very well for himself. He wound up becoming the referee for that fight as well. Governor Denver Dickerson had needed an affidavit, a written affidavit from the promoter Tex Rickard to make sure that that fight was on the up and up, because word on the street was Jack Johnson was going to take a dive against that fight with Jim Jeffries. He had 15,765 fans in the audience. There was an original agreement for a fixed fight, and Jack Johnson thought about it. 2 nights before the fight, he canceled on it. He said, no, I'm going to fight this man. So this was between Jack Johnson and Rickards, and he wound up getting that squared away, so the fight would wind up happening. Now, you had $10,000 bonus for both men. Signing bonus was originally $75,000 for the winner, and you had $25,000 for the loser. Now, this is a championship fight. The champion at this time is Jack Johnson. Man who came out of retirement was Jim Jeffries. He was 305 pounds. He had to shed 100 pounds. He wound up coming in at 205. And he's making all these demands because he could not take a chance in the establishment taking a look at him, realizing that he's going to fight a black man making less money. So he made sure that he got as much money as he possibly can. The following day, Jack Johnson proposed 50-50 split. Jim Jeffries won a 60-40 split in his favor. And both men agreed to $10,000 bonus. But guess what? Jack Johnson wound up getting $50,000, and Jim Jeffries received $66,666. And Jack Johnson was the champion. Jim Jeffries was the challenger. The reason why Jack Johnson decided to go ahead with the fight was because he tried to get a fight with Jim Jeffries. It was very important to him when he was the colored heavyweight champion. Jim Jeffries froze him out. He refused him. He said, I'm never going to fight a black fighter. He was straight up about it. And Jack Johnson, all he wanted, with all of the victories that he had under his belt, he wanted a shot at Jim Jeffries to defeat him. Even though Jim Jeffries was no longer champion, he was undefeated, and he would retire undefeated. So it was a big deal for Jack Johnson to get him in that ring because he wanted to teach him a lesson. And he gave him the goddamn business. Unbelievable. 15 rounds. Jim Corbett was calling Jack Johnson a yellow streak. He was calling him the N-word all through the fight. And what was beautiful about it was that Jack Johnson would have conversations with Corbin. He would walk Jim Jeffries into the corner where Corbin was. And as he's hitting Jim Jeffries with rabbit punches, he would continue to have these dialogues with Corbin. And Corbin would get very, very frustrated because there was nothing he or Jeffries can do about it. And Jack Johnson would be hitting Jim Jeffries with combinations, jabs, overhand rights. I mean, he busted him up like you won't believe. And this is what he wanted. He didn't care about the split. He wanted to get the man in that ring so he can show what it was all about. And Jim Jeffries was exposed. Now, I heard a conversation where someone said that that wasn't the real Jim Jeffries. Jack Johnson had carried Jim Jeffries for 15 rounds because he wanted to punish him. He could have gotten him out of there much sooner. The fact that he was off for the amount of time that he was off and he shedded 100 pounds is not Jack Johnson's problem. But that's the point that Jack Johnson wanted to make. But it caused a lot of problems when the fight was over. Because you had little black boys that was being spit on. The fathers of some of the white boys would hold the little black boy and let the little white boy punch him in the face, hit him in the stomach, throw him on the ground, kick him while he was down in the face and spit on him. They were hanging people. They were taking bricks and stones with handwritten letters and throwing them through the window. This was going on all over the country. Because Jack Johnson, who was a black man, did his job and fighting a contender who Jeffries actually was not at the time. But he gave a man a title shot. He defeated him, as Jeffries has done in the past. But for Johnson, it was different. He got the raw treatment. Those who looked like him got the raw treatment. It was disgusting, is what it was. A lot of people lost their lives. You had 10,000 white spectators listening in Chicago, outside of the tribute building. They had a megaphone. You had 30,000 listening in Times Square to the bout. And when they realized what happened, that's when the destruction started. But Jack Johnson was one of the greatest defensive fighters in all of boxing. He understood defense. He knew how to turn you into the sun. He knew how to parry punches. His IQ was very, very high. He fought a fighter by the name of Joe Chowinski. He was knocked out in the third round. It was an illegal bout, and both men were handcuffed and brought to prison. They did 27 days in the pen. During the course of that time, Joe Chowinski would teach Jack Johnson some offense because he was a very good defensive fighter, was Jack Johnson, but his offense and his foot movement could have been a lot better. And that's where Joe Chowinski came in. He was a Jewish heavyweight out of San Francisco. Very, very good fighter he was. He had good fights with Corbin, but he was knocked out himself by the Barbados Demon, Joe Walcott, a year previous. So Jack Johnson came from a very good background. Now, the last show we had, the brother BFTB had asked me about the Black Murders Row, and I didn't have enough time to go into details. And I'm not going to go into too much detail. One day I'll do a show completely on that. But I just want to talk a little bit about the first wave. This is the time that Jack Johnson, came from. You had Sam Langford, who fought Harry Wells 22 times, Jack Johnson 1 time, Sam McVeigh 15 times, and Joe Jeanette 14 times. You had Sam McVeigh. He was in a ring with Jeff Clark, the Joplin Ghost, Harry Wells, Sam Langford, battling Jim Johnson, and Joe Jeanette. You had Joe Jeanette. He was in a ring with Jack Johnson 10 times, Bill Tate, Sam Langford 14 times, Jeff Clark 8 times, and battling Jim Johnson. Yet Harry Wells was in the ring with Sam Langford 22 times, the Joplin Ghost, Bill Tate, Jeanette. Jack Johnson was in the ring with Joe 10 times, Sam Langford 1 time, Sam McVeigh 2 times, and young Peter Jackson once. You had Joe Gans He was known as the Old Master. He was in the ring with Sam Langford and Joe Walcott, Dave Holly, Jack Blackburn, and Joe Walcott, if I already mentioned him. You had Dave Holly. He was from Philadelphia. He was the king of the shoulder roll. He was in the ring with George Gunther and Jack Blackburn, Joe Gans, Ruff Turner, Dixie Kid, and Sam Bolden. You had Jack Blackburn, who wound up becoming the trainer for two black heavyweight champions, Joe Louis, and you had Jersey Joe Walcott. They both became champion, and Jack Blackburn was their trainer. He fought Panama Joe Gans and Kid Norfolk, Ed Palmer, and Harry Greb. Sam Langford, Joe Gans, and Bobby Dobbs. He was in the ring with Frank Childs, Joe Butler, Young Peter Jackson, Joe Gans, and Joe Walcott, as well as George Cole. Larry Temple, he was known as the Quaker City Terror. He was in the ring with Joe Walcott, Dixie Kid, George Cole, Young Peter Jackson, Sam Langford, Jeff Clark, the Joplin Ghost, as well as Jack Johnson. Black belt, his name was Claude Brooks. He was in the ring with Jack Johnson 4 times, Joe Jeanette 11 times, Jeff Clark, the Joplin Ghost, Battling Jim Johnson, Barbados Demon Joe Walcott, Young Peter Jackson 3 times, George Cole, and Morris. Now, you hear me bring up the name Battling Jim Johnson. Battling Jim Johnson fought Sam Langford. Sam Langford defeated him 11 times. Sam Langford never lost to Battling Jim Johnson. But Battling Jim Johnson got the shot with Jack Johnson, and that would become the first time a black contender will fight a black champion for the championship. So Battling Jim Johnson is an icon. You had Jeff Clark, the Joplin Ghost. He was in the ring with Dave Holly, Battling Jim Johnson, Sam McVeigh 3 times, Dixie Kid 3 times, Sam Langford 13 times, Joe Jeanette 3 times, Harry Wells 8 times, and Larry Temple 4 times, as well as Kid Norfolk. His name was William Ward 4 times. You had George Cole, Pennsylvania Terror. He was in the ring with Bobby Dobbs, Sam Langford twice, Joe Jeanette 4 times, Joe Walcott, Dave Holly, Dixie Kid twice, Jack Blackburn twice, Larry Temple, Young Peter Jackson twice. You had Panama Joe Gans, who was the colored middleweight champion of the world. In 1918, he sparred with Bill Brennan. Now, Bill Brennan was going to be fighting Jack Dempsey in 1920. And he was told to take it easy on Bill Brennan. Him and William Ward. And he couldn't resist himself. He saw how easy it was to hit Bill Brennan, and he made a clown out of him. And Norfolk, who was William Ward, got in the ring after him and finished the job, beat him half to death. And it was from that point on, these fighters never got the shots anymore. Word got back to Jack Dempsey, and that was it. Jack Dempsey said, once I become champion, I will raise the color bar. Because he fought another guy who broke his ribs. And this fighter, very good black fighter, broke Jack Dempsey's ribs. And that was it. Jack Dempsey said that's enough. So I just wanted to go briefly with you over those fights. I wanted to make sure that we truly understood who Jack Dempsey was, but at the same time who Jack Johnson was. James J. Jeffries, he was a good fighter, but he didn't give the opportunities. He didn't have enough fights. And I believe had he been given the opportunities to some of these fighters, he would have lost most of his fights. And that's just my personal opinion. So I just want to briefly talk to you about one other thing before I start taking some questions. When we historically look at fights, when we historically look at fighters, we have to look at the time in which they came. We have to understand what the fighter had to go through. 1910, Stanley Ketchel was killed by Walter Dipley. He was shot. You also had Joe Gans, who died of tuberculosis. A year before that, in 1909, you had George Dixon, who was the former bantamweight and featherweight champion. He died. And George Dixon was the first fighter black or white, to go overseas and win a title. He defeated Nuke Wallace. He was part of the Carnival of Champions. Now, I was asked a question in the last segment, and I should have went into further detail with my answer. As far as the first black and white fighters, I wasn't 100% clear on what the question actually was. But you had Tom Molyneux and Tom Cribb in 1810. Tom Molyneux was the second black fighter. Actually, he was the second fighter from America. The first fighter from America, you had a fighter by the name of the first fighter from America was Bill Richmond. The second fighter from America, excuse me, I was distracted for 1 second. The second fighter from America was Tom Molyneux. And Tom Molyneux and Bill Richmond happened to be black fighters. They were from America. They came over to England, and they fought the same fighter in Tom Cribb. Tom Molyneux fought Tom Cribb, and he wound up knocking him out, but it's a long saga as to what really happened. And he wound up getting exhausted because Tom Cribb refreshened himself, and he wound up winning the fight. So that was the first one of significance. Second one was Peter Jackson, and a guy by the name of Gentleman Jim Corbett. That fight happened in 1891. It went 61 rounds. The third fight was George Dixon and Jack Skelly. That happened in 1892, the Carnival of Champions. It happened July 6, 1892. And then you had this fight here. That happened 100 years later. Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries, from the time Tom Molyneux would face Tom Cribb. So that was very interesting. So I'll be taking some questions right now. Anyone have any questions? You can ask me questions as of right now. I can't see the chat, so I'm waiting for Stormy B, man. And I want to apologize for the distraction that just threw me completely off.
Yes, sir. So, chat, we're gonna open it up for questions from the chat, and you guys can feel free to pose questions to Scrapbook, and we'll answer them for you. Give me 1 second while I get ready to put the. I'm gonna put the chat up on the screen as well. Give me 1 quick second here. Give me 1 second here.
Yeah, you know what happened? I was in the middle of talking and I have a timer on my light. And the timer went off and the light went off. So I had to run over to turn the light back on.
Okay.
I apologize for the distraction.
No, it's okay. It's all good. Keeping the eye on the chat. Anybody got any questions out there? Please feel free to write them in the chat. And Scrapbook will be available to answer your questions. I'm just going to... It's taking me a second to put the chat up on the screen because I got to refresh it.
Oh, sure. Let me see. So let me go through my top 10 as Stormy is doing it. My top 10, Sam Langford is my number one greatest fighter of all time. I think I explained enough as to why he is, in my opinion, the greatest fighter of all time. The time in which he came, the men that he fought, as many times that he fought them. He fought champions, but not at times when they had the title, and he defeated them. He fought all the black champions in boxing history from the time of 1903 to the time of 1922 when he faced Tiger Flowers. Tiger Flowers wound up becoming the middleweight champion of the world when he defeated Harry Greb in 1926, but he still was a middleweight and wound up becoming a champion. Sam Langford fought the first colored light heavyweight champion, and that was William Ward. George was another good fighter at that time, but you had very good fighters during that time. So he was my number one fighter. Number two, you have Harry Greb. He was 45-0 in 1919. And during the course of that time, He fought every weight division, from welterweight all the way to heavyweight. So you have to give him credit for that. He was a hell of a fighter, was Harry Greb. My number 3, Sugar Ray Robinson. He was a 6-time champion, 5-time middleweight, 1-time welterweight champion. One of the greatest, just about the greatest fighter of all time. Pound for pound, he is the greatest. No one better than Sugar Ray Robinson, pound for pound. But he can make an argument of number 1, number 2, depend on how you see boxing, number 3, with Ray Robinson. But I have him as number 3. Number 4, I have Henry Armstrong. No one has done what Henry Armstrong has done, and you can't take that away from him. I have Muhammad Ali. I have Archie Moore. I have Benny Leonard, Tony Canzoneri, as well as Johnny Dundee, collectively ranked number 9. And I'll save my number 10 for another time. But those are and Jack Johnson's number 8, although he's part of, this tonight's discussion, but he's number 8, my greatest fighter as well. So,
okay, Scrap, we got some questions coming in now. We got some questions coming in now from brother Eric R out there. He says, I'm late. Who was Jack Johnson's head trainer?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
He says, he's asking who was Jack Johnson's head trainer?
Okay, so George Little was the
was the Johnson Ketchel fight a fight or an exhibition?
Okay, it was originally supposed to be for movie rights. That's what it was for. Jack Johnson had tapped Stanley Ketchel a little too hard in the second round, but he was just going through the motions, and Stanley Ketchel didn't like it. So as the fight went on, Stanley Ketchel saw an opening, and he caught him with an overhand right. But it was originally supposed to be for movie rights. He was supposed to carry Stanley Ketchel, but he was not supposed to lose the fight, if it makes any sense. It got out of hand when Stanley Ketchel tried to knock out Jack Johnson, but it was originally for movie rights. It was wasn't really a fight. They have it on record as a championship fight because of what happened, so they changed it. But it was originally supposed to be somewhat of an exhibition, was for movie rights, but it turned into a fight. Now it's on his record as a win for a championship fight.
Okay. 1 second here, Scrap.
Shout out to Blue Skulls, by the way, and Eric R.
Okay, there was my chat had frozen up on me a second. Let me scroll back up. Kurt is asking, how good was Obi Walker?
It was Kurt Anderson?
Yeah. Kurt Sugar.
My brother Kurt Sugar, what's going on, brother? Obi Walker was a hell of a fighter. A hell of a fighter. He was in the ring 14 times with what I consider a black murderous row fighter. And the sad thing about these fighters during that time is that they really don't get to shine. Elmer Violent Ray was a hell of a fighter. He fought Obi Walker 14 times. Obi Walker wound up becoming a colored heavyweight champion. And he was a very, very good fighter, was Obi Walker. Very underrated. An outstanding fighter. At that time, you had George Godfrey, the Libreville Shadow. 1926, Harry Wills wound up fighting Jack Sharkey. And he got disqualified for excessive holding, and some books would tell you a low blow. When that happened, the belt went up for grabs. So George Godfrey wound up getting a hold of the title. And then you had Al Walker and you had Obi Walker. So both these men wound up becoming the colored heavyweight champion. But that was a little confusing during that time because of the way it happened. But Obi Walker was a hell of a fighter. Like I said, he fought Elmer Violent Ray 14 times. An outstanding fighter was Obi Walker. Thanks for the question, Kurt.
Okay, we got another question from another Curtis. Curtis Price is asking, how many world champions came out of Philly?
Oh, my God. Oh, my God. 38?
38?
38 and counting. And counting.
Yeah, definitely counting.
And counting.
I'm going to update our poll right now. We've got the 40s is coming on. Scrap. We got 26% now. Remember, it was zero earlier. It was zero, but they would like you. 26% would like you to talk about the 40s next. 10% the 50s. The 60s is now at 16%, but the 70s has dropped down to 48%. So it's kind of evening out there, you know. It's spreading out, which is great. I'll leave that poll up until the end of the show. That way, you know, we'll have a great idea of what Scrap can come back for you guys next time. Bruce Goes is back with another question. Big Homie Coop. I'm sorry, let me go because Bruce had one question, but I'm going to go to Big Homie Coop first. He says, Scrapbook, who do you think had a better career, Joe Walcott or Jersey Joe Walcott?
The Barbados Demon Joe Walcott. The original Joe Walcott. He's the one that invented the bigger they are, the harder they fall. He was in there with Tommy West. A lot of people don't know who Tommy West was. And Bobby Dobbs and Joe Gans. He was in there with Sam Langford. I mean, he knocked out Jojo Lewinsky. And Jojo Lewinsky knocked out Jack Johnson in the third round. He knocked him out to get Pee Wee. So Joe Walcott is very underrated. He had a better career than Jersey Joe Walcott. Jersey Joe Walcott didn't originally want to be a professional fighter. He wound up working for sanitation, but he was Jack Blackburn's original fighter. But he couldn't commit because he already had a family, and that's when Joe Louis came into play. And when Joe Louis came into play, that's when Jack Blackburn wound up taking on Joe Louis, and he kind of shied away from Jersey Joe Walcott. But Walcott he needed the money for his family, so he would take fights in short notice and what have you. And when he got serious about boxing again, he had to climb the ladder. But both those men wound up becoming the heavyweight champion of the world, and they were trained by Jack Blackburn. So yes, the Barbados Demon Joe Walcott, in my opinion, had the better resume and he had the better career.
All right, we have now Bruce Goes is asking, who do you think was better, the first George Foreman or the second version that came back after 10 years off?
Second version, because of his technical, he had the ability to outsmart you, more textbook, he understood the game, made more money, and here's a man who wound up becoming a heavyweight champion the second time. So you had to be better the second time than the first time in order to do that, if that makes any sense to you. But yes, the second time that George Foreman fought as a heavyweight champion, he was the better fighter than the first time. So that's my answer on that. And
he was an older fighter fighting younger guys, fighting in a younger guys era. And one other thing, Scrap, he was asked that during that second career, and he said he thought he would clearly beat his younger self because he had made certain subtle adjustments in how he approached fighting. The younger version would burn himself out and just go out trying to be physically imposing, but he became more crafty as a older fighter and looked to set traps and use his strengths to his advantage, which was not always to just go out and get somebody, but allow someone to feel safe within the spider's web. Just ask Michael Moorer.
Yes, George Foreman in his second career would have beat the first George Foreman with that jab. He had one of the best jabs in heavyweight division in history. He had a remarkable jab, the George Foreman. Very underrated jab George Foreman had.
Yes, sir. You there, Scrap?
I'm right here, brother.
Oh, okay. So I got a question.
Yes, sir.
Who was the dominant middleweight of the 60s? You know how each era we have someone, right?
Yes.
So I remember the Zale and Graziano era, but who was, and of course we had Ray Robinson, but who was the dominant middleweight of the 60s?
Boy, you had so many good ones. You had Reuben Hurricane Carter, which is a sad story, but Hurricane Carter could have been champion, no question about it. He had the ability to do everything. He was very strong, very powerful. He was textbook. He just had too many distractions, and he couldn't complete his career. But had he been on the path of concentrating on just being a fighter and only a fighter, he could have been champion. So he was a dominating middleweight in the 1960s. You had Emil Griffith. Emil Griffith was part welterweight and part middleweight in the 60s. He was a very good middleweight. But I think he was a more dominating as a welterweight, but very good middleweight in the 1960s as well. But you had so many of them, Storm. Oh, my God. You had so many very good middleweights. You had Dick Tiger, Gene Fullmer. I mean, the fight these two men had was unbelievable. They fought a few times. But if I had to nail down one guy, the most dominating, so I understand the question correctly, the most dominating middleweight in the 60s, that's the question, right?
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, you had Georgie Benton. You had so many very good middleweights. Joey Giardello. Oh my God! I would have to say
Who reigned the longest then? Who reigned? Who was champion longest?
Emil Griffith.
Okay. Wow.
Because by 65, Ray Robinson had retired. Ray Robinson was no longer a force after 1958. But then you had Gene Fullmer. Gene Fullmer was, you could put Gene Fullmer, Dick Tiger, Emil Griffith. Those three really, really controlled the middleweight division during the 1960s.
Okay. We got a question from St. Cruisin out there that's asking, who was the fastest fighter that you've ever seen, Scrap? And I take that in person, not on TV, in person.
In person. Meldrick Taylor.
Wow.
I saw Meldrick Taylor fight in Atlantic City. He was fighting a fighter by the name of Courtney Hooper. I was sitting next to the referee who actually refereed that fight, because we were looking at a fight before that one. Oh my God, what's his name? He refereed the Ward Gotti fight, Frank Cappuccino. And we were sitting next together. The fight before that fight was Big Art Tucker and Camille Odom. And I didn't know Big Art Tucker was even fighting that day. I didn't look at the program. And he fought Camille Odom. Camille Odom was always in line for that 84 Olympic team. He was always ranked number 2, number 3. And that's one of the reasons why Mike Tyson kept going up to super heavyweight and heavyweight, because there was a couple of guys there that were trying to avoid, and Camille Odom was one of them. So Frank Cappuccino and myself were talking, and we were going through things and scenarios as that fight was on. And then he got up and went in the ring to referee the Courtney Hooper and Meldrick Taylor fight. Meldrick Taylor, when he fought that evening, he was wearing a knee brace. He just came back from knee surgery. And he did the ollie shuffle just to show the reporters that his knee was in good standards. And the ollie shuffle he did was amazing, but his hand speed was unbelievable. So I have to say Meldrick Taylor was the fastest fighter that I saw in person. Now you have Michael Dokes, who had fast hands also. He was very good. I saw him when he fought Evander Holyfield. I was at that fight. I saw a lot of fights with Michael Dokes. He had very fast hands. But as a fighter, general, Ray Leonard, when I saw Ray Leonard, he didn't have the fast hands like he had when he was younger. I didn't see him when he was a welterweight. I saw him, towards the end of welterweight going into junior, middleweight, and what have you, live in person. So I didn't mention Ray Leonard, but of course Ray Leonard, I would say, had the fastest hands, but Meldrick Taylor had everything. Fast feet, fast hands, he just didn't have the power.
Why were so many of the heavyweights of the 80s sidetracked with outside the ring problems? Because there were a lot of talented guys, but they all seemed to have different issues. You know, it was weird because that's why so many of them changed titles. You know, it's like you know, one day it's this guy, one day it's that guy. But they were all talented enough to become a champion, but not reign. What do you think was at the root of that? Was that cocaine era or something? Or
yes, they came into the crack era, around 85, 86, 84, 85, 86. They came in during that time, and you had so much of that stuff going around. It was like candy, and a lot of these guys got caught up in that. I knew a guy by the name of Ronaldo Mr. Snipes. His trainer was Hector Rooker, Gleason's gym. And that was Hector Rooker's pride and joy. But Ronaldo Mr. Snipes just couldn't get it together. He was a very good heavyweight coming up, but he really just couldn't get it together. I was at the fight when he fought, when he fought the Philadelphia fighter, Tyrell Biggs. What am I saying, Pernell? Tyrell Biggs. And Tyrell Biggs hit him with a beautiful punch that rocked him, you know. But I remember when he was in there with Larry Holmes. He was known as the man who dropped Larry Holmes. That's what they called him. That's what he was known for. But he was a very good fighter. Was Ronaldo Mr. Snipes. But you had Michael Dokes and you had Greg Page. You had R.I.P. to him. You had so many good heavyweights, but they just got caught up, and it's just unfortunate. But it was during that drug era.
Yeah. And Michael Dokes really let everybody down when he went over there and did what he did with Jerry Coetzee, huh?
Yeah, he had no business there. He had no business there, but he got dropped. I remember Michael Dokes, 1984. He fought Greg Page, and he used to spar with Muhammad Ali as well. All them guys sparred with Ali. Page and Tim Witherspoon and Michael Dokes. All them guys. They all sparred with Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali took care of them guys. He put them in hotels and fed them well and everything else. But yeah, Michael Dokes. I remember watching him for years. I said the last time I saw Michael Dokes, I sat with him and Buddy McGirt at the Kevin Kelly and Troy Dorsey fight at the Felt Forum. It wasn't the big garden. It was the small room, the Felt Forum. And that's when them guys fought. And him and I had a good time, man. Good. That's the last time I saw Michael Dokes.
That was a classic, too. Kevin Kelly and Troy Dorsey.
Oh,
what a
over
fight.
1,000 punches. It was in the Guinness Book of World Records.
Yeah, that was an amazing fight. Salute to brother Curtis Anderson, a.k.a. Kurt Sugar, out there in that super chat. He's saying, salute Scrapbook Boxing.
Salute, Kurt. Salute to you, my brother. Salute to you, man. Hope everything is well. Can't wait to talk to you again, man. Those who don't know Curtis, man, he's amazing. He's amazing. I don't know how he does it. I wish my memory was as good as Curtis. Curtis is unbelievable. Yeah, we have similar backgrounds. We used to train together. We were trained at Times Square Boxing, not Times Square, at Lenny Shore Boxing Gym. That's in Totowa, New Jersey. And we know similar people. So shout out to my brother Curtis Anderson.
We got another question from Bruce Goes. He says, besides Holmes and Tyson, who was the best heavyweight of the early 80s? Tyson was late 80s, but who's the best outside of Holmes, you would say?
Outside of Holmes and Tyson. Who was the best heavyweight in the 1980s, in the early 80s?
Yeah.
It's very interesting. Well, they thought that John Tate, who was a 1976 Olympian heavyweight, they thought he was going to do something. And looked like for a second he was, until he caught that punch with Weaver. Now, to answer that question as the best, wow.
You know what I'm going to go on a limb and say, Scrap?
What's that?
Greg Page.
In the early 80s.
Yep, but he was an enigma, Well, he was probably the most talented out of all of them.
Well, yes. See, that's why I was trying to make sure I understood that question. Talented-wise, yes. Produced, not so much, and that's the problem.
Right.
We talked about the drug. That's the issue. That's what I'm struggling with. Larry Holmes dominated everything. He was the guy. And he basically fought all of them guys. He stayed clean. He understood what he was in there for, But Page and all of them guys, man, they just couldn't keep it together. And that was the problem. But yes, talented-wise, yes. Greg Page, he was a hell of a fighter.
You know what I loved about Holmes? When I found out that he offered $10,000 to his sparring partners, that anybody could knock him on the canvas, he paid him $10,000.
Yes.
And Holmes was thrifty with his dollars, so he wasn't going to let nobody knock him down. Or
he couldn't get the proper sparring, Stormy, and that was the problem. Nobody really wanted to spar with Larry Holmes. In those sparring sessions, Larry Holmes used to pop that jab, and he would crack necks. Guys would come back to the gym with neck braces. They couldn't keep him in there too long, so he had to up the price. And he was training for some very important fights, so he just said, you know what? If anybody can knock me out, you're going to get $10,000. And you had a lot of guys that was in there trying to do so, and it made better preparation for him. Yeah, he paid them guys big money. But the $10,000 was definitely for if you knock me out, you're going to get $10,000. And that's to get the guys in the ring, because he couldn't get the proper sparring. That's what his problem was.
Wow.
In the early 80s.
What a fighter Larry Holmes was, man. And it's amazing. Even today, Scrap and audience out there are a lot of people, they'll say, yeah, Larry had the best jab. And they'll say like casual things about him, but they don't respect him because they say other things. Like in that one rap song where they said looking like Larry Holmes, flabby and sick or something like that. But that was the old Larry Holmes that came out of retirement and was fighting with a little bit of a pot belly. But when he was in his prime and fighting and defending his heavyweight 20 times, that was not him. He was a serious person to deal with. And I don't like how people disrespect that man, because he was every bit as good as Ali and some of the other fighters that preceded in history, like Joe Louis and everything. And all of them would have their damnedest time trying to compete with him, even in their primes against his prime. That man, he didn't have the chin like Ali, but he had that will and that determination and that spirit to get off the canvas and fight back. He didn't have, the fanfare and accolades of a Joe Louis or Ali, but he had the respect of his peers in that ring. You know what I'm saying? Like you just spoke, Scrap, that nobody didn't even want to spar the guy. You know what I mean? And it's just a shame. Larry Holmes was, and I remember his reign, after Ali, and I liked him. I liked Larry Holmes because when you watch him box, you just look at that jab, and something that was very underrated, he had pretty good head movement. Larry Holmes was one of those fighters who could evade your shots by dipping out to the left. Most guys like to lean and dip to the right, but he could do both. But that's what made him complete, because he could move both ways. He could slip a shot to the outside and still get his jab off on you. You know what I mean? Or go ahead.
You know why? Because he was in there with the best brawler and the best boxer, Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali. He was in there with Kenny Norton. He was taught very well, was Larry Holmes. Larry Holmes, they say he quit in the amateur show, and he didn't really take on Bobbick the way he should have, so he lost that bout. They questioned his heart. But as a professional, can you ever question this man's heart? I saw him train once in my life. I was privileged to watch Larry Holmes train. This was back in 1981, I think it was. And I saw his whole training session, sparring, hitting the bag, everything. This man can punch. When he hit the bag with the jab, you hear it around the entire gym. It sounds like someone take a baseball bat and is hitting that bag with all their might, and he's jabbing you. He was a hell of a fighter, was Larry Holmes. And I had that privilege of watching him train.
Yeah, amazing fighter, and he just doesn't get the respect that he deserves. But he'll always get that respect when I have something to say about him, because I recognize, and you would beg for a Larry Holmes for today. You know what I mean? You beg for a fighter like that today, because I can guarantee you this: there's not many out there, if any. So,
no. Shout out to my brother Drew Titan. I see him in the building. LLC.
Yes, sir.
I saw there was a question there. Someone had asked me, who was the best fighter at my youth? I'm not sure the question. I'm going to shoot dice on it. I guess when I was young, what was the best fight I saw? If he's asking personally, like if I actually saw him in person, oh, man. I would say Alexis Arguello when he fought Ernesto Marcel. That was some fight. That was really amazing. Another person when I saw was Aaron Pryor and Alexis Arguello. That was also amazing. The first fight. And of course, Salvador Sanchez and Gomez. I was considering myself a young man then. But
I got a question for you, Scrap.
Some good ones. Yes, sir.
About Joe Frazier.
Yeah.
After his loss to George Foreman, Joe was kind of like inactive. Why do you think he was so inactive? Was he injured, or was there something that we didn't know about, or had he slipped a lot and they just kind of was like holding him back? I'm not trying to make up anything. I'm just asking because I was young, then as well, like you were. We all same age, but you may have had access to more information as to why Joe kind of became so inactive after his loss to Foreman.
Right, now you're talking about the first Foreman or the second Foreman fight?
The first Foreman fight. Because when he fought him that second time, that was what, in 75?
76.
76. So yeah,
right.
And I think what he had only the Ali fight and that fight, right, between his loss. 75 and 76, right. Mm-hmm. Right. And then he retired. Jimbo Elliott. That was in 81. Ali fought in 81 against Herbig, and he fought against Jumbo Cummings, yeah.
Yeah, Cummings, Cummings. They both retired in 81. But Joe Frazier was supposed to be retiring several times. And he would sit back and watch the landscape and see what was the best available fight. Because after that first George Foreman fight, he didn't really, George Foreman did a number on him. And he really didn't want to continue at that moment, because what did he have to gain? He still had the title. George Foreman was there. He wasn't going to defeat George Foreman. Muhammad Ali, they were trying to wait and see what he was going to do. He wound up getting another shot at Muhammad Ali, and then he fought him the third time in Manila. So those were the fights that he was really interested in. He was also interested in another Jimmy Ellis fight, but those were his options. So he kind of sat quiet. He still had the title. After he lost the title, that was it. When he lost to George Foreman, that was it. It was hard for him to really fight the way he was fighting before. He was selecting his fights at that time.
Yeah. Joe Frazier was another fighter that I really respect, and I just love what he brought to the sport. You know what I mean? And he was a man's man. You know, it was like Joe just his fight typified spirit. You know, like someone mentioned, there's a statue of Rocky in Philly, but no statue of Joe. I don't know how that is. Well, that's really screwed up, right? Well,
there's one now. Bernard Hopkins actually paid for the statue. They were designing it. I'm not sure if it's complete now, and if it is, I don't know where it is in Philadelphia. But they were making one. Bernard Hopkins put the money up.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, Joe Frazier was something else. I had the pleasure of meeting him. You know, I almost lived in Philadelphia. I was at those gyms all the time. And I would go into his gym a lot. A lot of times he wasn't there, Stormy. A lot of times he wasn't there. He had other guys running it, but then he would be there. And he was something else, man. He was a good guy to talk to. And I miss Joe Frazier. Joe Frazier was a heavyweight champion.
Yes.
You know, in every sense of the word. The problem with Joe Frazier, he didn't understand the times he was in. You know, he wanted to live and let live. Ali was going in a different direction. He was trying to make sure that we understood what was happening in front of us. And Joe Frazier, you have to understand also, his career was ran by Kovalev. So he couldn't make up his own decisions all the time. You know, they said you had to do this. That's why he wasn't in the tournament. He pulled out of the tournament. He wound up fighting Buster Mathis Sr. for the New York SAC in a ring belt. And, you know, eventually the WBC. But he just didn't, he wasn't part of that group of guys that were doing what they were doing. You know, he had to go the way Clover Lake was telling him to go. But as a fighter, he was a hell of a fighter. No question about it. Great fighter.
Yes, sir.
Now, I can't see who's in the chat just to salute everybody before we get off because there's the 1940s, 50s are blocking it. Can you see who's in the chat? I don't want to leave anybody else on it. I want to thank everybody for tuning in.
Yeah, Derek McGee joined us just a moment ago. St. Cruising.
I see Big Homie Coop.
Big Homie Coop is out there.
My brother Curtis Anderson.
704
Drew
Joe.
I know he's in the building. Shout out to Drew Titan.
Yeah, 704 Joe is out there as well.
Salute, brother.
Yeah. But that's
I want to thank everyone for tuning in. I do appreciate it. It was a little distraction here. My light went off. I have it on a timer. So in the middle of me talking, I had to run over, turn the light back on. I had to readjust my thinking because anytime I do any of these lives, whether it's Three Wise Men, my own channel, the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff, all the videos I do, everything's always at the top of the head. I never have anything written down. That's just the way I am. So I have to readjust my thinking as to where I was. So I apologize for the distraction. And hopefully I got a lot of good information that you could take back and reevaluate. And we'll take a look in the future, see what's next.
Yes,
and
sir.
Thanks, Stormy B, man, for the platform. Brother Curtis Anderson. Shout out to you, my brother.
Oh, man, you're quite welcome here. I'm enjoying this as well, man. This is like, hey, you know, I'm taking extra credit, you know, classes here with what you're doing with your boxing conversations. Just to read the final results of the poll before we end them, the 1940s came all the way up to 24%. The 1950s, the 1950s is at 8%. The 60s maxed out at 16%, and the 70s maxed out at 53%. And the question in the poll was, which past era would you like Scrapbook to cover next? So, you know, that's what it is. It's 1970s. They want to hear something from the 70s, Scrap. So, you know,
there's a lot of information on the 70s. That's not a problem.
But what I would suggest is take them back to some of that stuff from the 70s that they don't know about. You know what I mean? Because everybody know Ali and Duran and those guys, right? But I'm sure you have more than a few that you can introduce them to for some classics for a little homework sake.
Yeah, I will do that. You had Edwin Virouette. You had the Virouette brothers. You had Edwin Virouette. He had a brother. Edwin Virouette fought Roberto Duran twice, but you had a brother, Aldolfo, who fought Sugar Ray Leonard. You had a lot of guys in the 70s. I'll be more than happy. There's no problem there. But, man, the 40s. If y'all knew about the 1940s, man, you would be shocked. One day we'll talk about the 1940s.
Yes, sir. So we're going to end that poll right now and keep that in mind for the next go-round. And we got Earl Taylor Sr. That popped into the chat as well. So, and those results of that poll, Scrap, are out of 41 people. So 41 people, participated in the chat. So thank you all for doing that. And it means a lot that you came into the show this evening and participated like that and listened to what Scrapbook had to offer, as well as, the feedback, because we like that. That way we can help. It can help shape how we produce content and bring it out there, because we want to present you with stuff that you like and also some stuff that you may not be aware of. So it's like, it's a dual edge there, but we do enjoy doing this for you guys. You got some final words, Scrap?
Yeah, once again, thanks everyone. St. Cruz in the building, Curtis Sanderson, Bruce Goals. Everyone that showed up in the building. I'm not sure if BFTB is in their building. I know Drew Titan is in the building. But all those who showed up, man, thank you so much. I do appreciate it. One day I'll talk about some trainers. You had very good trainers and you had good managers. A guy by the name of Jimmy DeFrost. Jimmy DeFrost was an outstanding manager. He was, back in the 20s. He used to have a cigar. He put together the Harry Grabbin and the Toy Bulldog Mickey Walker fight. He wanted to have William Ward, who was Kid Norfolk, but he couldn't get him because it was just too much that he had to go through to try to get Kid Norfolk, because Kid Norfolk was a hell of a fight. Jack Dempsey and others. So one day I'll talk about trainers and managers, but very good conversation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.
Yes, sir. And if you hold on just a second, Scrap, I'll, talk to you a moment after we sign off real quick. But, man, this has been another great show. Historical boxing conversations with Scrapbook Boxing. Man, what a show. This is a nice segment to have this and have Scrapbook, come out here and share his wisdom with us all, man. You guys don't know what a treat it is to have someone like that in contemporary time, to be able to go back and reflect with history and bring us up to date on this. I mean, this is not something you just getting anywhere. I mean, you can go sit up in the library, but man, the fact that we have someone here that can share like that, that's why you guys need to invest more into the attentiveness of this kind of thing, because it's not something that's easy to come by. And I'm not a proponent of shaking people down or nothing, but when Scrapbook does this show, it would be nice if some people can show some love there too in that super chat, because this brother is doing this thing. And let me tell you something. Education means a lot, but it means a lot too when you show gratitude. You know what I mean? So I just wanted to say that. We're going to get on up out of here. We catch you guys on the next one. Peace to everyone out there. Remain safe. Have a wonderful week. And we'll catch you on the next one. Peace.
Peace.